Today's gospel reading is a cautionary tale for those of us who run churches, who have gone to divinity school, and whose job it is to lead worship, don the ancient vestments of the church, and to pray and to preach. What Lynn just read is also a rather unflattering picture of those of us who do such things, and I find myself wanting to permanently shed my long black robe and to shorten the sermon, or maybe the prayers too. Heck, let's just go outside. These things all seem to be bad in Jesus' eye. Now, I'm fairly certain I don't do these things for the sake of appearances, at least not for my own appearance, but the church historic, the church traditional, the church that you remember that was your mother's or your grandmother's. Those churches had rules, and church rules die hard. As Tevye says, tradition. We hold on to tradition here at West End both tightly and lightly. The pandemic had much to do with the dexterity of our grip, but we were already well on our way before March of 2020. Change had been in the air when our friend and your pastor, Michael Boss, was internally transferred to the pulpit of Marble Church, which left your own pulpit here vacant. Actually, it was there, but we fixed that. And wondering, all of us, who would come next? And you did all the things that churches do when facing a vacant pulpit. And if I do say so myself, you did it rather brilliantly. In that time, and in many times that we face all the time, you held tight to what is really important to you, to the ways and the customs and the ideas that build your faith week over week. And during that time, I know that many of you learned to let go of some things that maybe weren't serving you as well as they once had. 6 years ago, this congregation formed a 10-person search committee, hired a top-notch search consultant, and talked with pretty much everyone you could imagine across the congregation and across all of collegiate. And that committee spent months reading applications, something like 67 in total, of many, many very fine ministers, each who would have served you very well. Now, there were screening calls, and there were deliberations and shifting of resumes from one pile to the other, who was in and who was out. There were interviews with the committee, and then with the other senior ministers, and then with members of the executive committee, and then with the larger central office staff, including the COO, CFO, VP of real estate, and probably a few other white men in suits. The committee spent months discerning, welding down, sometimes saying, we need to start over and look at all of this again. How did we miss this? And then it all came down to a final round where I'm told 2 candidates were invited to come and lead a worship service and to preach in a boardroom, not a good place for preaching, and then to lead a strategy session. Around the table on that day were not just the 10 participants that you had sent, not just your 10 search team members, but 4 other members from full consistory. A representative from Marble Church, one from Middle Church, one from Fort Washington, and one from Intersections. This was just 6 years ago. Right now, there was a penultimate round in May and a final round in mid-June, and that was a committee and a charge and a time for this church that was all about reimagining. And you did. And you still make me feel like the luckiest pastoral beauty contest winner ever. Now, reimagining what ministry looks like in the lived attributes of a new senior minister is hard and faithful work. Everyone has a different idea of what a pastor is, what their pastor is, and what pastors should do, what their pastor should do. And the hashing out of priorities and skill sets is much the work of what search committees do. Now, as hard as they do this work, the position description for a new senior ministers do tend to be just slightly shorter than the Gospel of Mark, with sadly just about as much expectation for their new senior minister as Mark's community has for Jesus. There are moments in the church, as it turns out, when we like to forget our humanity. Either someone is so godly, the best possible, most God-fearing, all-giving church lady jazza girl ever born, who is somehow above all of us. Or on the other end of the spectrum, someone so outside our community and outside of our beliefs that we see them as despicable and somehow not very welcome. I had a very human experience with the search consultant that led this search. His name was Kevin Chase. And he first called me one day to say, "Hey, Will, there's a job at West End Church that your name keeps coming up for. Are you interested?" Flattered I was, and definitely curious, but you all know me well enough 6 years in that I tend not to mince words, and self-deprecation is a primary way of how I move through the world. "Kevin," I said, "I'm flattered. And I've seen the job description. That's quite a tome. And I've read it, Kevin, and there's much there that I think I can do, and some of it quite well. And a great deal there that I know makes me really excited. I think it looks truly exciting. It's an incredible opportunity for someone." And Kevin said, "Well, what about for you?" "Oh," I replied, "I've read that profile, been all over that church's website, talked around in all my circles. And Kevin, I think you're looking for a straight white guy, possibly a woman, with a doctorate and kids, nearly out of high school, but probably into college. And forgive me, Kevin, I just don't see a lot in here for this single queer guy living downtown with an international theater background that is still somewhat skeptical of the church." "I hear you," said Kevin. "And I don't think you're wrong to pick that up. But I don't think that's what they're actually seeking. Can you imagine this position with me?" he said. "Imagine it with your resume and your letter and all of your materials. Imagine it just for a conversation today. I think there's an opportunity here for all of us to imagine something that is very different." That was Kevin's invitation. Now, as my tombstone will one day read either "too smart for their own good" or "curiosity killed this cat," I find opportunities to dream and to scheme and to imagine and to think and to daydream too good to pass up. So I said, "Sure, yeah, why not?" And next thing I knew, I had a Skype call. Skype was a pre-Zoom invention that happened because we wanted to, not because we had to. It was so novel. I had a Skype call with Kim Moore and with Cambridge Ridley Lynch, and then the process began, and my job was to keep my feet on the floor while moving steadily forward, imagining. Now, one of the many gifts my husband Patrick enjoys sharing is mentoring young people entering the arts or even slightly more advanced in their artistic careers when they find themselves stuck. You know Patrick, he's wise and kindly, and he's very good at what he does. He's a good mentor. And I've been in the room sometimes when he does this, and I've seen how the young people light up and let their shoulders relax. And whenever he gets the question, "How do I know what job I should take?" or "What should I do now in order to get the next job that I really want?" or "Should I go to grad school?" Patrick stays very neutral and his warmest, most benevolent smile beaming. And what he says is this: "Imagine that your life is like a flower. And every once in a while, a petal will begin to open, and it will fall down into place. Your job is to notice that petal and to say yes to it, and to see how the flower is opening for you in that moment. Petals fall, one foot in front of the other, walking deliberately through a process, and a thought. Imagination. For me, one of the things I had a sense of in that last West End Church senior minister search was that I was indeed an outlier. The question I had for Kevin about this being an early 50s family person, probably white, but not necessarily, maybe gay or lesbian, but probably not, but definitely someone with a bigger profile and cleaner linear progression through ministry and church that I had, was one that I held throughout this whole process. As a list of 6 candidates emerged, I asked Kevin, what were the characteristics of the other 6? What was my handicap, I wanted to know. He told me it was everything I had thought it was. Older, doctorates, previous senior ministry positions, more connected with the RCA. The what? I said. The list went on. Sheesh, I said to Kevin, I guess the only thing I can be is me. If the committee's already got a nice cucumber, a solid radish, a hearty turnip, a beautiful acorn squash, and a fresh pea snap, I don't need to be a vegetable. I'll be a fruit, I thought. And a pineapple one at that. Throughout that entire process, I never thought I was the front runner. I don't actually know whether or not this is true, but what I do know is that this was a process of God's imagination. This was a process of God and West End and me. That was it. West End was also conducting a process with a whole bunch of other candidates, but that didn't concern me. Was I being compared against them? Sure. But is that ultimately how a person gets hired? Generally not. Over that season of petals opening and falling into place, I will say that I became gradually and then pretty much all at once more excited and more nervous as the process went on. For most of the time, I was simply putting one foot in front of the other, having the conversation before me, staying in that moment, but then something switched. This happens. And I realized I wasn't just the foil to these other 5 great candidates or the straw person in the pool. I realized this was the call that I was hearing, that this was the job I imagined for myself. I had to check in with my ego. I started to really want it. This was a season of imagining and reimagining and imagining and reimagining again. Petals opened, time passed. Look at the flower of our church today. Look at the petals that are still opening all around us. They don't look like the old petals. They're babies, and they come from the very heart of the flower. In the Gospel of Mark that we heard this morning, there's a different kind of opening, of falling. An impoverished widow hands over her last 2 pieces of copper into the offering box. She no doubt heard them fall and land with a quiet rattle somewhere down on the bottom of that box. Now that offering box was, according to temple tradition, meant for collecting alms for the marginalized of society, the ones who could not tend themselves. This was the charity box to help those who could not help themselves. Now, chief among the list of marginalized people in the ancient Near East are widows. Women couldn't own property. They went from their father's house to their husband's house. They couldn't work, well, not in any profession you or I might talk about in church. They had no money. And if they had not kindly male children who might take them in, they were living on the edge of destitution. Imagine that. You lose your husband, the father of your children, in a society where you have no rights, and suddenly you have to rely on the charity of the alms box at the synagogue, at the temple, to feed you. The offering box in which this widow offered her coins was indeed her offering box. It wasn't hers for making an offering. That's not what she was supposed to do with it. It was hers for the gathering of an offering. This box was meant to take care of her, and she gave all that she had. Imagine that. A collection plate meant as an ATM, not a nighttime deposit box. Imagine that. When the plates come around later today, we don't. Our elders would have some questions if you did. But imagine a world where the plates go around the church and you take out what you need rather than put in what you can. Imagine a world where there's enough. Imagine giving to something that is supposed to give to you. Now, along the way up to that offering box, she walks. And the widow walks past many people. I really wish she had a name. Neither Mark nor Luke remember it. God does. And we'll trust that in the fullness of time, we'll get to know her. Along the way, she passes the scribes in their long black robes hovering all about that Jesus had just been chastising. She passes the temple dealers, the ones who sold the small and large animals for sacrifice. She might have passed some people that she actually knew, well, one day, way back before things changed, when they used to invite her to lunch, but now only whisper, "Oh, there she goes." She used to think she had it all, didn't she? No doubt she passes a disciple or two. And then, with everything she owns and about to give it all up, she walks right past the Savior. Right past Jesus. And here Jesus is doing something we hardly ever see him do in Scripture. He's sitting. We know that he's often fishing or preaching or healing or sailing or feeding or walking or eating or sleeping on mountaintops. He's an active guy. When he preaches, he sits. When he eats, he sits. But nowhere else does he just sit. But here in this story, Jesus does this thing that we never hear him doing. He sits and he watches. Don't just do something, Jesus. Sit there. And what is he watching? Here the story gets even weirder. He's watching people put their money into the offering plate. Doesn't he know that we don't do that? That we avert our gaze when we pass the plate to our neighbor? That we don't look at the person in front of us at the ATM or cash machine to see what they're doing? That we keep a respectful distance even across our accountant's desk when we sit there nervously awaiting their computations? We don't watch money. We certainly don't watch other people's money. And we really, really, really don't sit and watch other people deal with their cash as if it's a spectator sport. But Jesus does. He pulled up the best seat on the mountain, sitting right there, just watching all afternoon. Imagine that scene with me. Imagine being seen by Jesus when you are giving everything you have. Everything. You are. Today we are 3 weeks into some deep personal reflections about money, about our money and about our relationships to it. This is the beginning of a longer stewardship season. And I've been hearing from more and more of you about how interesting you're finding the Our Money Stories study journals. And I know some of you are already asking about when we can start discussing these in small groups and deepening our study by talking with each other. And that's all coming. But right now, for these weeks, we're focusing on ourselves. We are sitting, we are watching, we are noticing, we are self-reflecting, remembering, releasing, and reimagining how our money and our faith may intersect. We're watching the petals open. We're placing one foot in front of the other. There are still no pledge cards. We're still going deeper. If you haven't picked up a journal yet, or if you've misplaced it thinking, oh, I'll never do this, I already know how to give, I encourage you to pick one up in the back of the sanctuary today. Even if you never pick up a pen to go with it, even if you don't write a single thing, give it a read. Keep it on your bedside. Let your dreams do the writing. Imagine that. From the imaginations of a pastor search committee 6 years ago. Through the constant imagination and reimagination of how to be a church in a pandemic that we knew not what it is. To imagine what new partners and new life for our old building might be. To imagine sustainability for West End Church. To imagine sustainability for each of our siblings, for Fort Washington and for Middle and for Marble too. To imagine now how we're living together fully. Imagine too what the consistory and staff and I are already imagining for how we're going to grow next year. Grow. Grow. You heard me. Grow. Some of the stories we tell ourselves about West End are as due for remembering and releasing and reimagining and restoring as our individual money stories are. As our building comes back to life through the hard work of so many of you. If you're still here in about 45 minutes, there'll be another 500 people in this building. As our musical offerings and our outreach to the community continue to make community, which means a place where people find sanctuary and art, which is another name for God, and heart. As we gather at tables, as we feed people around tables, as we stretch our bodies in weeknight yoga and stretch our minds in Sunday worship, we are growing. Imagine that. Imagine that growth. Imagine that story. Imagine it as it is certainly true that even now, God is doing a new and marvelous thing for you in the midst of all your pain. That God is doing a new and marvelous thing for our world in the midst of war and protest and climate unrest and a million other things. Imagine that God is doing a new and marvelous thing for our church, even in the midst of even us. Of even us. God is doing a new thing. Thanks be to God.